So I invite Prof. Bishnu Mohapatra for his presentation on literary imagination and the making of a collective Odia identity.
Thank you very much, and I thank Dr. Pradosh Mishra for inviting me, and also to the institution, Kavitendra Vanjan, Chair, to invite me to this meeting at BHU. This is not a historical talk. This is more of a semi-historical, more of a conceptual, ground-clearing talk. A talk that looks at the ways of understanding collective identity, and partly about perspectives. And I strongly believe that it's because of the clash of perspectives that we truly obtain new insights and novel ways of looking at the same set of historical and literary materials or facts, if I may. And please excuse me if I sound a bit autobiographical, because I reflect a bit on my own work. And that actually brings me to something that in the morning Professor Jatin Naik mentioned about critique or criticism, which is a kind of critical perspectives. But there's also another meaning of critique, which is a way of finding out what can and what cannot be done with methods. What can be known, what cannot be known, which is what Immanuel Kant would do in his critiques. First critique, the critique of pure reason, is all about what reason can do and what reason cannot do. So this is a critique in that sense, that what is that we can do? What is the extent of our understanding about collective identity, and so on and so forth. When I began looking at the question of collective identity in 1980s, there was a pure division of labor among historians, students of politics, and the students of literature. There's a very little cross-fertilization. People who worked on the politics of it, they merely looked at the unification of Odia-speaking tracts right from the late 19th to early 20th centuries up to 1950s, how the Odia-speaking areas were amalgamated, unified, what is the kind of politics, what demands are made, what colonial state did, and what are the nature of demands, and all kinds of ways in which these demand was put forward. And second, the mobilization that was necessary to bring a collective voice and force for some kind of reckoning in a colonial context. There's very little that if you look at very good writings about history, you will hardly find any mention or anything about literature or literary. You will hardly find, if you look at the references, there's very little of that. Similarly, you will find people who looked at cultural identity, you will find they looked at various elements, but literature came in, but the literature's position was also presented as if literature truly only reflects a certain way of looking at the question of nationalism and identity. Fortunately, today, after many decades, I must say that things have changed. Even while I was researching myself, I did one special chapter on looking at the cultural imaginings. I looked at how identity was not merely reflected in literature, the literature was the ground in which identities were articulated. Identity was really made to appear in certain ways. And so this is what really one would say fortunately there's a big change the way in which we look at the question of cultural identity. And when you look at Odia identity today, I think we are doing a much better job than, if you ask me, no disrespect meant for any historians or any scholars, including myself. But I must say that, look, we are far better in a way, much more multidisciplinary, much more aware of what to look for when we think about construction of identity and stuff like that. Now these ideas, how could one think about the question of identity, collective identity in history, and what is the importance of certain ideas? I was reminded of the methodological considerations. I was reminded of a very famous essay by Chair-BHU, which is actually written in 1907. The language is very mystical. It's called The Life of Nationalism. It actually spoke, I'm not talking about nationalism in terms of its content, but there is an interesting metaphorical use of ideas' emergence, its presence, its mobilization, and its fulfillment in that essay, which means that Chair-BHU says that the ideas emerge, sometimes clandestinely, sometimes secretly, sometimes not within the gaze of humanity, but then it has to contend with the enemies. It has to contend with, and Chair-BHU brings in the metaphor of Lord Krishna taking birth in a prison, contending with enemies. If you don't even look at the metaphor, the idea is basically the ideas have to contend with competing other ideas. And then in the third phase, the idea then actually becomes dominant. And finally, the last phase of the mobilization of ideas is the idea actually rules and fulfills its mission in the world. As if the ideas actually emerge in this world, they have a trajectory, and when the work is done, the ideas are almost returned back to a cosmic space once again. It is almost like saying that, look, how do we understand the emergence of the ideas, nationalism as an idea? In 1980s again, in post-Second World War period, a lot of people who wrote about nationalism, I remember a very small pamphlet by London School of Economics, Eli Kaduri, called Nationalism. He thought it's a 19th century doctrine, and he thought that doctrine has almost, if I use Chair-BHU's metaphor, has fulfilled its mission, and nationalism is not going to be any more relevant. But we know, 2026, that nationalism is still pretty much a kind of in full mobilization all over the world. People still talk about identity, people talk about the way identities are connected to territory, power, and stuff like that. That actually takes me to a point for saying that, look, sometimes the implications of these ideologies and ideas, we only appreciate, we only see it in hindsight, in retrospect. This is perhaps what almost more than 100 years before, little around 100 years, 1820s, when Hegel wrote The Philosophy of Right, he said, the owl of Minerva takes its flight when it is dusk. Meaning that when ideas truly unfold over a period of time, then only a philosopher can make sense of it. While it is unfolding, you don't really see much. Only when it comes to a point, you look back and you see how ideas operate, how ideas unfolded, what ideas have done. So we are in that period when we look at question of identity and so on and so forth. Today, like it was in my 80s when I was researching it in Oxford, the understanding of identity, including the Odia identity, has to really traverse the two ends of this methodological spectrum. One, that identity is given, which is in the literature known as a primordial conception of nationalism and identity. that identities are given. I belong to an identity. This is something which is given, this is something which is part of the world, this is the furniture of the world, identity. And I'm this identity, I'm that identity, I'm an Odia, I'm an Indian, I'm this and that. This is a given fact. And this primordial idea is a very powerful idea. It remained for a very long time as an important resting point when we discuss about identity, about cultural identity, about any identity, anything which is large, anything which is collective, sufficiently large. And this is what really drove a lot of people to begin with to say that identity exists. And then they bring about evidences to show how the identity exists and so on and so forth. This point of view was then contested, according to me, very nicely, because which suggested that identities are not given. They are not what Heidegger would call facticity of the world. It is given. It is not given. It is constructed. It is made. So in 1983, when Benedict Anderson wrote a book which became very famous called Imagined Community, it was presented that identities are truly imagined and constructed, made, remade. And therefore, the element of belonging, the element of belonging to a particular identity can be contestatory. People can mean different things when they say, if you ask, for example, there was an interesting book on Tamil identity when somebody went to ask, what do you mean by being a Tamil? So people given answers as to what you mean by. If you do the similar exercise for Odia identity, I am very much sure that many people would give you very different, interesting answers at what does it mean for me to say that I am an Odia. And there's nothing, if there is not one answer, many answers, I'm not unhappy about it. It's just to say that the way we think about identity is no more a primordially given identity that I have to accept. This is what it is, nothing else. But something that meaning has to be made. Something has to be thought about that identity. Something has to be made, remade, contested, challenged, and stuff like that. So this is something which we are today traversing between these two extremes. One is the primordial, another one is what we call a constructivist idea, that anything can be constructed. People say, oh, anything can be imagined, but no, that's not true. Not anything can be imagined. So these two extremes, one is the primordially given, another that anything can be imagined. We are actually traversing. Any interesting understanding of Odia identity, collective identity, has to remain in this in-between territory. To say that why is it that we interpret something to be modern, but at the same time think of it as ancient. Why the language of ancientness is necessary for a phenomenon which can be truly modern. And when I say modern, it doesn't mean, for example, for a very long time, many people thought that it is colonialism which actually is responsible, which is not true. Because we know that in pre-colonial period, Odias also had a sense of collective identity. It was not as pronounced. It was not as, because we have only evidences of some kind. For example, when we know somebody is writing Utkala Bhasare Kalimu Rachita, which means that there is a territorial sense that, look, I'm writing in a language which is spoken by people out there. There's a sense of broader connotation that, look, there are people out there who also speak the same language. I'm writing in something which is not entirely of my village, of my clan, but a larger community. So today, to say that this collective identity was entirely a product of a colonial modernity would be historically inaccurate and quite sloppy. Although colonialism's role in terms of, there is no way that we can deny the way it quickened certain processes, it gave certain ways in which identity discourses moved, certain imagination that moved in certain direction. So So this is a fundamental challenge while talking about Odia identity today, that that long history, earlier people thought everything happened during colonial period. It's not true. Now, at least we know that in the early modern period, where people are really thinking about the collective identity, the language, in a way which actually created certain background conditions, on the basis of which colonial processes superimposed and quickened that process. And so this is an important methodological thing that we now, most people would accept. Earlier the theorization was very sloppy when everything was attributed to the colonial and colonialism. Now we know that our modern is also extended beyond the colonial. Before, which you can call that period anything, early modern or whatever term, doesn't matter. What matters is that modernity is not coincided with the arrival of colonialism. So this is, in the sense, one has to see the historical period slightly differently. And what is for example, by 19th century, again, based on what Professor Jatin Naik said, with the print culture, with the print coming in, by middle of the 19th century, when the newspaper came in and so on and so forth, you would find that in many ways you will discover when people are writing even a letter, even people are writing something about Orissa, there is a collective pronoun that you find in the writings. Ame Odia, Ame, that we. Who is that we? You will find that implicitly, that we-ness, that there's something large, there's something bigger, there's something broader, there's something that I exist with others, is very much changing in the 19th century. When you are writing about the condition of Orissa, we, our, writing one Odia, one of the Odias, there are many such instances that you will find which will give an indication as to why a certain ways of seeing ourselves, a certain larger we is emerging, and print is quickening that process. Print, certain kinds of ways of thinking also changing. And this brings me to the third point, which is a creation of a new subjectivity. When you think about cultural identity, when you think about collective identity, we are also talking about new subjectivities, new consciousness, new way of looking at my relationship with the larger world, new way of looking at with others, looking at geography, looking at history, looking at literature, looking at one of the reasons that you'll find in the late 19th, from late 19th till pretty much till 1950s and 60s, many of our freedom fighters, many of your people who are even civil servants were all writing in Odia. If you look at even a person like Hare Krishna Bhatta, for example, you would be surprised how much he wrote, besides leading an active life in politics. And he was not one. There are many, anybody and everybody who wanted to be part of a collective life was actually doing a Sahitya Sadhana. Why? Why is that subjectivity emerging, which is not true today? You don't find that anybody who is doing anything about Orissa or thinking about is actually writing about Orissa's history or poetry or literature or something like that. Why is it? Why certain ways of being emerged towards the end of the 19th century in a very big way and continued for almost, I would say, 50 odd years, where the literature or the literary was no more. Professor Jatin Naik said, before academia where literature is being done, literature actually done on the pages of newspaper magazines by people who are not professional literatures. Those are not really teachers of literature. Am I making my point? So this is where you find the situation is very different. Suddenly you find people thought that literature is too important a subject to be left to only professional writers. Everybody wanted to write in Odia. Everybody wanted to contribute. Everybody wanted to enhance the prestige of the language. Everybody wanted to say that this language is mine. This is deeply connected to the way I am. The way this is a way of defining who I am. There are many Sanskritists here. You see, parichaya is one of the etymological. This thing about parichaya is that knowledge, broader knowledge about oneself is parichaya. And this etymological thing is very important. I was once reading essays by Pandit Nilakanta Das. This is a small essay where he talks about, it's an important aside, where he says, Durbhikya, small essay. He said, Durbhikya in English is called famine, which is actually means hunger. Hunger, famine is hunger. The etymological roots of famine is hunger. Famist, when you say I'm famist, you are hungry. The Odia equivalent of famine is Durbhikya. It is not the same. Etymologically, Durbhikya means that you really don't have anything to give an abhyagata in bhiksha. Bhiksha is in other words, famine is not hunger. Famine is a disruption of your way of life. Are you getting my point? So the etymologically, I'm very fond of etymological exercises. I find them deeply fascinating, that how through these words, you get a glimpse of what people were thinking, alluding to. Similarly, in African languages, the famine actually means there are different kinds of famines. For example, in Kalahandi, the name for famine is actually makar. And what is makar? Makar's etymological meaning is maharkya. When something becomes costly, when something becomes expensive. Look at the allusion. It's not about hunger, it's about something becoming expensive. Makar. So when you go to Kalahandi, nobody said, people started imitating journalists saying dot parche. Drought basically. But most of the local is makar. Like Durbhikya. Durbhikya points towards a disruption of your life and way of life and so on. And Asmita. Asmita was not a word that I didn't encounter in my research as a name or as a word for collective identity. It is important to remember that this Asmita word is only becoming popular now. If you look at Gopal Praharaj's Abhidhan, you will find Gopal Praharaj in Asmita's word gives the same, this thing with the Radhana Prayesh Chilika. Bismita, Murtva, when I lost my sense of who I am. Bismita Rahedi, I'm forgetting, Bismita Asmita Rajana or something like that. Asmita is about individual self-consciousness. Today, Asmita is a word which is becoming popular. This is worth looking at, because how the things have changed. You hardly find the word Asmita is being used. I may be wrong, if somebody can, because I have looked at a lot of materials and so on and so forth. That samuhika, that collective, and so on and so forth. So this, all about the print, all about literature. Two things I want to say about literature and stop. One, and often we find that a lot in the criticism that I read in Kulsahitya and so on, including Vishwanath Kara's Vivida Prabandha, where Sahitya Samalochana and Sahitya Bhumika, so on. There are two ways. This is again a 19th century dominant idea which is prevalent in other parts of the world, including in Germany. A Herder, 18th century, and so on and so forth. which is that language has two very dominant functions. One, of course, a designative function, that you say chair, chair, table, designate something. But language is also constitutive of the world that you occupy. Language shapes your questions. Language shapes the way you think. Language is shaping your thoughts. Language is not merely afterthought, that you think something and language comes to help. That's not really how then language becomes the marker of your collective life. And by the 19th century, in many places, it's also coming from England, it's coming from Germany, it's coming from many romantic traditions, the language becomes the marker of your collective identity, precisely because it's in language that your collective life is truly reflected. So therefore, literary imagination is not, it has a constitutive function. It has a function that tells a lot about how your world is, how you think. And if your thinking, if your imagination about society, about who you are reflected in literature, it's not reflected as a designative way, it's reflected the way it shapes the questions, shapes the discourses, and so on and so forth. And so this has to be remembered. The reading of, for example, the literature sometimes I find sometimes have to be therefore done in a way which is far more interesting according to me. And this is where, whether you talk about the language devotion, how language becomes subtly, it's not only an Odia phenomenon, it's not merely happening in Orissa, you find Tamil, language is described as a mother. Language is described as, because after all, this is a language world. This is also a thought world. You see? It's as much as a bakery world, as much as it is a Madhyama world. You see? It is that world in which language operates in these discourses. You have to speak, you have to think, you have to objectify, you have to write. And this is the literary imagination, that identities are connected with this. Therefore, print played such an important role. Why everybody felt that you have a good literature. Literature not merely reflecting society, literature is also shaping your society. That's what the Vishwanath Kara's essay on literature is all about. It's not a mirror alone, it's also shaping you. It's transforming you. And it's not that you see it and so on and so forth. Finally, all identity discourses, when you think about it, always are riddled with contradictions. There's no point in talking about collective identity as if everything is hunky-dory with this world. Then we are not doing our job. Even in Utkal Deepika, one of the news items, where people have gone, as you know, Utkal Sammelana Pracharak Mane used to travel to various places. Singhbhum, various, ଯାହାକୁ ଆମେ ବିଚ୍ଛିନ୍ନାଞ୍ଚଳ ବୋଲି କହୁ ସେତେବେଳେ ମୁଁ 1920-22 The report is saying that when people went to various villages and talked about amalgamation of Odia-speaking tracts, the tenants were talking about land revenue. So the reporter is saying that all these Utkal Sammelani Pracharaks, when he went there, the peasants were not connecting to them on Desamisra. They are asking them what will happen to the land revenue. You see, in other words, to say that everybody's way of thinking about land identity is the same will be a mistake, will be an exaggeration. Similarly, identity, why middle class was so important in terms of the identity, because it is also shaping itself. The middle class was shaping itself in Orissa, and identity was the most important instrument. I'm sorry to say, this is not to belittle middle class efforts. It's to see how the efforts were connected with certain consolidation of middle class. Madhubabu had one model of consolidation, Gopabandhu Das another model. What is Madhubabu's model of consolidation of that class? You become independent, you become economically strong, you enhance your economic power, And that's how consolidates you, your society. What is Gopabandhu Das model? You serve others. Society is a system of needs and affiliations. And now, through your empathy, through your connection with others, you strengthen society, strengthen the bond of society. Both are necessary. But you could see there's a distinct ways in which people thought about consolidating a society. There's no point in saying that no, only one idea. No, there are many interconnected ideas. And sometimes these ideas were in conflict because people wanted to become, now for example, sometimes my friends would say, we have to be powerful. Sometimes we have to be also sympathetic. We have to be also kind. We have to also nice. You see, sometimes there's a conflict, sometimes the emphasis are different. Edward Said made a distinction between two things. One is called filiation and affiliation. Filiation is where things that you belong to. As I said, I'm born into parents which are Odia. I'm born into an Odia speaking family. That is filiation. I have no choice. I'm born into it. Second idea is affiliation. What is affiliation? How I make it my own. How do I make sense of myself after belonging to it? That is affiliation. Therefore, affiliation always has the elements of agency, freedom, debate, and contestation, and solidarity. Because it's affiliation where I'm trying to understand how am I an Odia, how am I an Indian, how am I a citizen of the world, how am I this, how am I that. And through affiliation, I make something as my own. It is just like in the Advaita Vedanta literature, you put nididhyasana, where you make the knowledge your own. You make it work for you. Only Sravana Manana is not going to do, nididhyasana also is necessary. Same idea. You make it on your own. I think we have traveled quite a bit of distance between, in terms of studying how identity politics works. I always recommend people to look at the first issue, 1936 1st April issue of Nobino. In that issue, there are many people have written about Swatantra Utkal Pradesh Gothan. People don't read one thing in that, which is a play by Sachi Rautrai called Miss Odisha. Miss Odisha is a play where Sachi Rautrai is critiquing this political compact. Sachi Rautrai is a radical. He sees that this unification movement is also a class-based movement. And what in that play, what happens? There is a Mahant. I don't want to say who is that Mahant is, because there is a Mahant who is very active in the unification movement. There was politicians, there was this, there were landlords and so on, British Sahib, all having a party, because Odisha has been unified, separate state, not unified fully, 1936. And there, towards the end of that play, Sachi Rautrai brings in hordes of hungry people, and they come to invade the party, because you see this is the end of that play, where hordes of hungry people are entering into a party which is celebrating Odisha's separate statehood. What Sachi Rautrai is telling you, that look, every unification, every project also has an ideological darkness attached to it. It is our task as critical theorist, as historian, to understand, important to understand light as much as we understand darkness. So thank you very much.